Fly with the elite airmen of the Third Reich on wings of the Luftwaffe.
The Messerschmitt Me-262. It ushered in a new era. It revolutionized aviation. Had it arrived just a year earlier, it could perhaps have altered the outcome of the Second World War, and therefore the very fabric of modern Europe. When it first entered combat in 1944, the Me-262 jet fighter was the world's most advanced combat aircraft. In the hands of an experienced German combat pilot, Messerschmitt's 262 jet fighter was invincible. In the Allied pilots who first faced it, the plane inspired awe and terror. Jet propulsion was only one of the revolutionary aspects of this amazing machine. The 262 also heralded the arrival of swept-wing technology. With a top speed of 540 miles per hour, it could outpace anything in the sky. This finely restored 262 at RAF Cosford's Aerospace Museum is one of the many captured as the Allies swept across Europe. Some of the lessons learned from it paved the way to a new age, the age of the jet. The seeds of jet propulsion go back to the beginning of the century. Henri Coandard's turbo propulsor of 1910 was one of the earliest attempts to utilize turbine-generated thrust. It used a primitive ducted fan principle. On its maiden flight, the strange little aircraft burst into flames and crashed. Following the First World War, turbo superchargers like the Moss unit on this Packard biplane enhanced piston engine performance. It enabled flyers to carve new world altitude marks faster than the record books could log them. The first true jet engine was developed in Britain. Frustrated by years of government indifference, Frank Whittle, a former RAF pilot, successfully started the prototype to the W1X jet engine on April the 12th, 1937, and secretly ushered in a new age. At the same time in Germany, flight tests with this hybrid rocket-powered Heinkel HE-112 were receiving strong government backing. The Nazi regime was eager to see new propulsion systems put to use. 4 HE-112s were modified to test the prototype rocket motor, but only one was successfully flown. Throughout the 1930s, German aircraft designers skirted around the restrictions imposed on them by the Treaty of Versailles. A thinly disguised fighter like the Heinkel HE-70 Blitz posed as a high-speed mail plane. As Hitler gained control, advances in aviation were secretly promoted. Emphasis was placed on speed. New propulsion systems were eagerly fostered. The loophole in the treaty was that in 1919, jets and rockets seemed only distant dreams. Unknown to Germany's neighbors, engine designer Hans von Ohain, under Ernst Heinkel's patronage, had already developed an advanced jet engine. On August the 27th, 1939, his device lifted the tiny Heinkel HE-178 skyward. This was the first jet-powered flight in history. 5 days later, the world was plunged into a war that would span 6 years. Hitler entered the conflict with hopes of quick victories, using air power to strike hard and fast. In the heady days at the beginning of World War II, German forces swept through Europe. As victory followed victory, the need for a more formidable aircraft power plant was of little interest. In the eyes of the Führer, nothing could stop the daunting might of the Luftwaffe. The troops of the Reich now marched into Paris. Europe had crumbled before the Nazi juggernaut. There was no need for better or faster aircraft. The seemingly invincible Luftwaffe remained unchallenged. But the winds of victory began to change. In what became immortalized as the Battle of Britain, German and British pilots engaged in a deadly struggle high above England. By late 1941, fortunes had changed. The pride of Germany lay in pieces across Fortress Britain. In Germany, cries went out for the new, the stronger, the faster. Thoughts turned to the possibilities of the jet. The world's first successful twin-jet aircraft, designed specifically as a fighter, was Heinkel's HE-280. Ernst Heinkel's passion for high-performance aircraft had created a long line of firsts in this exciting new field. The HE-280 was first flown as a towed glider during 1940. These unpowered flights were made to trial flying characteristics because of the late delivery of the jet engines, thus making virtue of necessity. Throughout World War II, the Luftwaffe placed great emphasis on ease of maintenance, and in that the Heinkel HE-280 wasn't a problem. Early German jet engines, strained to the limit, weren't expected to have a very long lifespan. And because of this, they were designed and made with the utmost simplicity. The end result was an engine that could be quickly replaced. Engine mount hardpoints and hardware interfaces were limited in number and within easy reach. A panel on the upper surface provided ground crews easy access to the engine, which compared with its piston-powered counterparts was surprisingly light. The Heinkel displayed superior workmanship, highly refined aerodynamics, and rugged construction. When the 280's engines functioned properly, the aircraft was a pleasure to fly. Like most early jets, it was somewhat underpowered and had a notoriously short range. It first flew by jet power on April 2nd, 1941. Heinkel's 280 was at that time the most sophisticated and advanced jet plane in the world. Paralleling German efforts, Britain's Frank Whittle worked frantically on the first of two prototype Gloucester E-2839s. This was a research aircraft and was to put Allied jet propulsion theories to the test. Simply constructed, the airframe was built to accommodate Whittle's jet engine. By May 1941, the Gloucester took to the air in the first flight of an Allied jet. But the Heinkel 280 was years ahead of the British jet. In a trial fly-off, it completely outflew the Luftwaffe's best prop fighter. Even with advanced features including an ejector seat, problems with performance and range, compounded by Heinkel's political disfavor, killed any chances of the 280 becoming the world's first operational jet fighter. That honor was to go to another. The Messerschmitt Me-262 lacked much of the sophistication of the Heinkel jet. But it had a formidable image with its sleek, swept-back wings and two Junkers Umo 004 jet engines slung below. The shark-like fuselage gave it a look of lethal elegance. The first four prototypes were built as tail draggers, the long nose pointing skywards. It was the kind of aircraft that even looked fast when it was standing still. And Messerschmitt had built the airframe to be rugged and dependable in action. Like the 280, the Messerschmitt fighter was designed for ease of maintenance, mandatory for a plane destined to operate from primitive airfields under combat conditions. The Junkers engines could be worked on or replaced without any extravagant equipment. Fuel and electrical systems were easily reached by panels located in the fuselage. The 262 was a perfect fusion of sophisticated state-of-the-art technology and simple design. The engines weren't ready for the first flight trials, so a 700 horsepower nose-mounted piston engine was used instead. Finally, in July 1942, the third Me-262, powered by two long-awaited Umo jet engines, was ready to fly. The first successful flight of a jet-powered Me-262 was on July the 18th, 1942. The engines were deemed flight-worthy, and with Flug Captain Fritz Wendel at the controls, it became the first of its kind to take to the air. During taxi runs, it was found the tail wouldn't elevate, so the test pilot tried a novel technique. As Wendel later recalled, "Immediately I touched the brakes, the tail lifted and the elevators began to bite. My turbojets ran like clockwork, and it was a sheer pleasure to fly this new machine." The flight was not without incident, however. On touchdown, fuel that had accumulated in the bottom of the left engine nacelle burst into flames. But the damage was slight, and the aircraft flew again that same day. In the United States, the race for jet power had not gone unnoticed. Bell Aircraft's Model 27, later known as the P-59 Aerocomet, was powered by two GE turbojets, based on the original Whittle engine from Britain. Within a year of initial design work, the plane was ready for testing. It was transported by rail to Muroc Army Airfield in the California desert, and on October the 1st, 1942, with Bell test pilot Bob Stanley in the cockpit, the XP-59 took to the sky in the first flight of an American jet aircraft. Unfortunately, performance was not markedly improved over piston-engined aircraft of the day. But in spite of this, limited production of the Aerocomet began, and Bell went on to build over 60 of the planes. The jet had come to America. Back in Germany, the 262 was modified. Emulating its Heinkel jet competitor, Messerschmitt designers adapted the aircraft to nose wheel configuration. The tail dragger had bad visibility during takeoff and landing. The wings blocked airflow to the tail. The jet's thrust angle made takeoff even harder. The nose wheel would iron out these problems, but it also proved to be the plane's Achilles heel. Poor tire design and a weak strut assembly led to numerous accidents. In fact, the strut was so weak that even the slightest sideward impact could lead to catastrophic failure. The landing gear was raised and lowered hydraulically. Although in early 262s the main gear was deployed by gravity, the pilot would use a sideways yaw movement and the airflow to lock it down. In most regards, the Swallow, as it came to be known, was a marvel of German engineering. Easily built by relatively unskilled laborers, it was a simple yet ingenious aircraft. The fuselage consisted of separate components, quickly and easily assembled. As a unit, it could be removed from the wing and repaired and replaced in the field without difficulty. The nose package, containing the landing gear and the aircraft's weapons, could also be removed as a self-contained unit. Its four 30mm cannon had pneumatic cocking and were fired electronically. The two upper cannon carried 100 rounds each, and the two lower ones 80 rounds. At the tip of the nose, the 262 housed a combat camera to record the fate of its victims. The Messerschmitt Me-262 first tasted action in April 1944, while it was still part of a test squadron. 5 months later, this was replaced by the world's first all-jet operational fighter group, Kommando Novotny. Named after the air ace Major Walter Novotny, the group went into action on October the 3rd, 1944. 5 days later, its first jet was lost, when an unsuspecting pilot was jumped by an American P-51 Mustang. After landing, a wire mesh guard is placed over the intake to prevent anything from being sucked in. Prop pilots found the jet's traditional stick, with the gun trigger at the top, comfortably reassuring. Ground crews always double-checked the gun safety switch. The Me-262 carried a lethal combination of firepower. Safety was crucial in the field, with stockpiles of high explosives and volatile aviation fuels sharing the same environment. The airfield was a dangerous place to work. Here, the pilot waves the fuel truck out of the line of fire of the 262's array of cannon. Not a good place to park. In action, the jet was easy to support and didn't require the highly refined fuels of the piston engines. Instead, it simply tanked up with J2, a specially brewed version of diesel oil, and the aircraft's 4 fuel tanks took 655 gallons of the precious liquid. The aircraft was certainly well designed for a fast turnaround on the front. At the closing stages of war, some US pilots had the task of flying captured 262s out of Germany. Bob Strobel found the ease of maintenance impressive.
One of the things that you want to be able to do in combat is to keep the maximum number of aircraft in operation. And to do that, you oftentimes have to change engines on them. Well, changing an engine on a Thunderbolt is at least a full day's job, if not 2 or 3, even under the best conditions. And yet I know for a fact you can change a jet engine on a Messerschmitt Me-262 in 30 minutes.
Each jet engine had a small 10-horsepower internal starter motor that ran on 2-stroke fuel. This small apparatus made the aircraft independent of cumbersome auxiliary starter units. The starter motor was located in the intake bullet at the front of the jet engine. Each of the starter motors could be electronically triggered from the cockpit, or if that failed, manually started with a D-ring and pull cable mounted in the bullet tip, rather like starting a lawnmower. But before the engine was turned over, the ground crew performed its daily ritual, inspecting the intake for debris and checking the compressor section, turbine and stator blades. Next came the exhaust nozzle assembly and exhaust bullet. Ahead of the exhaust bullet was the exhaust turbine. This was checked very closely too. Damage of any kind to these delicate parts demanded immediate repair. The exhaust bullet, sometimes referred to as the onion, was unique to the Swallow's engine. Designed to move fore and aft, thereby increasing the exhaust area and enhancing thrust, its maximum travel was just over 7 inches. Other aspects of the Me-262 were just as innovative. The vertical tail and rudder were unusual because they came equipped with a trim tab, manually controlled from the cockpit. A small mechanical indicator let the pilot know just what position the trim tab was in. The pilot adjusted the horizontal tail by hand as well, vital in controlling an aircraft traveling at such high speeds. In an attempt to tame the Me-262's high landing and takeoff speeds, the aircraft was equipped with free-floating leading-edge slats. These greatly improved the wing's poor lift characteristics at slow speeds. In a glide, they extended at anything below 187 miles an hour. In a climb, at anything under 280 miles an hour. Retraction, on the other hand, resulted from aerodynamic forces at high speeds. The slats, which were mounted on ball bearings, had a tendency to stick. Ground checks for this were imperative, because if they didn't work in perfect unison, the pilot would lose control entirely, especially during landing and takeoff. Pre-flighting the aircraft was painstakingly carried out by the ground crew. All controls were manually and visually examined. As this went on, other Luftwaffe ground personnel replenished the pneumatic system's air tank and checked the landing gear's tire pressure. Hydraulic fluid, critical to safe flight, was topped up before every mission. This precious liquid controlled the flaps, landing gear, and brakes. The process was precise and thorough. Overlooking the slightest detail could prove fatal to the men in the air. Caution was a rule. These aircraft were built in difficult wartime conditions.
The rivets were rough on it, the skin was rough on it. It had sometimes even had wrinkles in it. it must have been very difficult for them to obtain the metals and the materials they needed to produce that airplane. The engine was not very well made and was really subject to failure, and it was due primarily to the raw materials and the conditions under which they had to be assembled and put together.
Messerschmitt had also designed the jet well for the pilot.
Your forward view was excellent, and with a tricycle landing gear, it gave you even better view for takeoff and landings. That was good. Cockpit arrangement was good. The layout on it was good. I think just generally the whole thing was engineered well to suit pilots.
Maintenance of the jet fighter wasn't much different from most other World War II combat aircraft. German field conditions near the end of the war were anything but ideal, but the Me-262 was just as rugged as many of the Luftwaffe piston-engined aircraft. However, foreign matter was frequently sucked into the intakes and posed a constant hazard to the Swallow's jet engines, making intake covers mandatory for every plane. A conventional nose wheel tow bar was used whenever the aircraft was moved around the field. This was made extra secure by cables attached to the main gear struts. The cables spread the towing loads and reduced the stress on the fragile nose gear strut assembly. Towing the plane was a job left to the Kettenkrad track cycle. This small gasoline-powered half-track combined plenty of torque with excellent maneuverability and was ideally suited to the task. The Kettenkrad could operate over a wide variety of terrain and in all kinds of weather. As the Luftwaffe's most valuable asset, the Me-262 was often afforded the luxury of covered and camouflage revetments, which, because of the constant threat of Allied air attack, soon became a necessity. The elite man chosen to fly the Swallow found it an extraordinary experience. Gunter Rahl, the Luftwaffe's third highest scoring ace with 275 kills, explains.
I took the chance to get a checkout on the 262. And this was very sensational to me, you know, running up very slowly on the runway, the engines very slowly, because you have to watch the temperature. If you accelerated your throttle too rapidly, you go to over temperature and you get fire on your engine. Could easily happen. So this was to be careful, you know, as a fighter pilot, have a throttle in a propeller engine, you just very rugged, forth back. You didn't care for that. In the 262, you have to observe this.
With his instructor standing on the left wing, an Me-262 student pilot begins his taxi. Virtually all of those chosen were experienced combat flyers, so instruction centered on the quirks of the tricycle landing gear and the temperamental nature of the jet engines. The Swallow's throttle was tricky and had to be handled with exceptional care, especially during engine starts. Starting the engines was an involved process. First, the small Riedel two-cycle starter motor kicked in, and the main turbine spooled up. Once 800 to 1,000 RPM was reached, the electrical ignition system was turned on. At 2,000 RPM, the starter engine was disengaged, and at 3,000, the throttle was moved to the idle position. When running, the main engines were rated at nearly 2,000 pounds of thrust each, with a turbine speed of 8,700 RPM. Me-262 trainer jets weren't available till late in the war, so the pilot's first jet flights were always solo, a daunting prospect for even the most seasoned flyer. Instructors remained in radio contact throughout the course of the flight. The effortless performance of the aircraft never ceased to amaze Luftwaffe pilots. Speeds exceeding 500 miles an hour were stunning to men who'd never flown so fast, even during maximum performance dives. On the other hand, the slow throttle response of these early jet engines caused problems, especially during takeoffs and landings. Whereas propeller-driven aircraft reacted instantly to throttle movement, jets demanded that the pilot think well ahead.
Once you get airborne, it was a very heavy aircraft, taken up speed. And until that time, it was not too maneuverable. So therefore, we protected the takeoff and landing periods by the old-fashioned fighters, 190 or 109, over the field, over the airfield. Another sensation was a very, very good radio, receiving transmission. There was no interruption in the engine, you know, all this. And it was very quiet, very loud and clear for that time. As you had in a normal, in a propeller fighter, you always had in your telecom, you had your very strong background noise. I didn't recognize this in a 262, and it was very, very comfortable.
To a fighter pilot, speed is intoxicating. And at 500 miles an hour, it was rare to find a flyer unimpressed by the Me-262. At the time, the world's piston engine speed record stood at 469 miles an hour. The Swallow broke that mark nearly every time it flew. Here, at last, was the aircraft with which the Luftwaffe could reverse the fortunes of war. Vastly outnumbered, and with its cities in ruin, Germany hoped that with this new technology, it could win back the skies and save the Reich from destruction. D-Day, June the 6th, 1944, signaled the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. Forced onto the defensive, Hitler was no longer the hunter, but the prey. The Führer was obsessed with the 262's potential as an offensive bomber. This obsession with revenge and attack would move Germany one step closer to final defeat. Within weeks of the Normandy landings, other advanced instruments of terror were thrown against the Allies. The most infamous weapon of vengeance was the V-1 flying bomb. Unpredictable and deadly, it heralded the beginning of a new kind of warfare. The V-1 proved difficult to counter and savagely effective. Equally impressive was Messerschmitt's revolutionary interceptor, the tailless Me-163 Comet. The rocket-propelled Comet was capable of near-sonic speeds and boasted climb rates spectacular even by today's standards. Renowned Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland was an ardent supporter of the Me-262 as a fighter. He once said that flying it was, quote, as though an angel were pushing. Galland was convinced the 262 was a generation ahead of any fighter in the sky. He argued with Goering that production should concentrate on the Focke-Wulf 190 and the 262 only. No other aircraft, he claimed, were as essential to the defense of Germany. Hitler fanatically insisted the 262 be used offensively as a lightning bomber rather than the defensive fighter so desperately needed. But the Führer's lack of vision wasn't the only impediment. The experimental nature of the aircraft itself had already slowed the process. Ceaseless pounding by Allied bombers and victories by Allied ground forces had all but sealed the Reich fate. The heavy destruction wrought by round-the-clock bombing had taken its toll. Irrespective of Hitler's blind insistence on transforming the 262, the plane probably couldn't have entered service any sooner than it did, by which time any opportunity to turn the tide of the air war had long passed. German industry was stretched to the limit, and the average German lived in a netherworld of charred rubble and sleepless nights. Germany was in ruins. Millions were dead. Only young boys and old men remained to wage war. By late 1944, defeat was inevitable. Most hoped simply to survive until the bombs stopped. In the middle of this madness, Me-262 production found itself beset by yet another problem. Competition had arisen in the form of the Arado AR-234, a short-range attack bomber and reconnaissance aircraft. The 234 was a composite of some of the most advanced technology in the world. Powered by the same UMO 004 engines, the 234 was a major drain and soon bled dry the already anemic jet engine supply. Some efforts were made to free up the supply of UMO engines by adapting 4 BMW jets for the Arado. Ironically, this reconnaissance plane was much more suited to Hitler's idea of a blitz bomber. The 262's logistical problems turned into a nightmare. Hitler's insistence on forcing a fighter to be a bomber only compounded the problem. To Luftwaffe ace Günter Rau, the proper role of the 262 was vividly clear.
You know, Hitler always was thinking in offensive measures. And the best example is the 262, you know. He wanted to make a 262 to a bomber without any electronic, and, you know, he dropped the bomb, they never saw where the impact was, you know. It was stupid. But he was thinking in offensive measures, and Galland said, no, we have to produce fighters, fighters, fighters. But they come pretty soon. And he was right. At the end, he got across with Göring, you know. Göring blamed him and the fighters because of the biggest success of the 8th Bomber Fleet on the British at night. Then he resigned and he took over the Wing 44. Hitler asked him, what are you doing? He said, I want to get the Wing 44 and prove that the 262 is a fighter, which he did.
By April of 1944, the first planes were sent into service at Lechfeld. The following October, this unit, by then called Kommando Nowotny, was equipped with some 30 of the new jet fighters. Shortly after entering combat, the Swallow drew blood for the first time. In June 1944, 2 Lockheed Lightnings and a de Havilland Mosquito fell victim to 262 guns. Another Mosquito survived, however, returning to England with photographic evidence of the new fighter's existence. Though it lagged behind, Britain's new Gloucester Meteor had a layout similar to the 262, but was much less sophisticated. Powered at various times by a variety of Rolls-Royce jet engines, it saw limited action during the last year of the war and was only marginally effective. In July 1944, Meteors embarked on their first sorties against V-1 flying bombs, recording their first V-1 kill on July the 27th. Incessant Allied bombing raids pounded Germany. By late 1944, Hitler finally conceded that air defense was imperative. Stories of a German superjet tore through Allied ranks. The 262 slashed through bomber formations at unheard-of speeds and was superior to every single enemy fighter. It was even faster than the gun turrets on Allied bombers. When flown by a competent pilot, it was simply untouchable. But Germany's fate had already been sealed.
It was a plain fact that we're going to lose the war. No doubt. Whether you get better aircraft, better fighters, or better protection, it's a matter of time. But the specific air situation would have considerably changed if the 262 would have been produced in masses. It would have changed the American bomber situation, no doubt.
But it was too little, too late. The Me-262 could not stem the tide of war. Allied forces advanced relentlessly. Germany's factories, its cities, and its people were beaten. In a final act of defiance, Luftwaffe pilots, embittered and out of fuel, torched their own planes to leave nothing for the victors. The spring of 1945, Germany's military might had been crushed, and the Allies were pushing deep into the heart of the Third Reich. Allied fighters and bombers could fly virtually unchallenged in the skies above the fatherland. Little remained of Germany's ability to make war or even defend itself. Every day, the bombs rained down. The devastation was total. Germany's once great industrial heartland was reduced to rubble. It could no longer fire the furnace of war. Hundreds of thousands, old and young, military and civilian, lost their lives. The Third Reich literally caved in on them. By war's end, over 7 million Germans were dead. As Allied forces advanced deeper, they discovered exciting new technologies hidden throughout Germany. Technology retrieval teams, like Watson's Wizards, scoured the countryside in a trusty old C-47, earmarking anything of significance. General Watson recalls.
We could land it almost anywhere, and we had to do that. In a lot of cases, we landed in cornfields and sleep under the wing and have breakfast under the wing and take off the next day to go somewhere else to find something.
German aircraft were of particular interest to Operation Lusty, as it was codenamed. Teams had the job of getting captured aircraft out. Watson sent Bob Strobel to deal with the Me-262.
He said, go down to Leckfield, take charge of the group down there, train the pilots to fly the Me-262, train the crew chiefs to maintain it, and ferry him out to Cherbourg. And he left me with my mouth wide open, was I trying to get to ask him, hey, hey, what do I know about? And he's gone, So that was my first introduction to Lusty. I found about anywhere from 25 to 30 jet fighters on the field, around the perimeter of the field, and revetments and in various conditions.
U.S. teams worked fast, encroaching Soviet forces adding to the urgency. Germans helped to get the remaining 262s airborne.
We worked with these people and didn't find any animosities amongst them. They were apparently pretty proud of the airplane that they had. They wanted us to like it, and they seemed to be agreeable to working with us towards the end that we were going for, trying to get those airplanes out of there.
Great Britain was also quick to exploit the technology. Captain Eric Brown flight tested the 262.
Many aspects of their engine technology and their armament technology showed they were very advanced. And in fact, after we actually captured a lot of these aircraft, we were rather horrified to find how far ahead they were.
Among the extraordinary weapons discovered was the Ruhrstahl X-4 air-to-air missile. It was slated for use on the 262 and had been extensively tested from a Heinkel HE-111. Even more lethal 262s were discovered, including one equipped with a huge 50mm cannon. The barrel projected 7 feet in front of the plane and was so heavy that a counterweight had to be added to the tail. Because it was produced in relatively large numbers, more Me-262s were recovered by the Allies than any other German jet. Bob Strobel ferried many of them back to Cherbourg in France and became very familiar with the aircraft's unique qualities.
Was really impressed with the enormous speed, the effortless speed, the quietness of the engine, and the vibration-free. I was astounded at these 400 and 500 mile speeds that we're making without doing any great, just tapping the throttle a little bit.
Surviving Me-262s are few, and well-preserved examples are rarer yet. One of the most interesting belongs to the Planes of Fame Museum near Chino, California. Historically significant because at one time it was owned by billionaire pilot Howard Hughes, this 262 had a taste of revisited glory in the film Jet Pilot. The same aircraft, shortly after the war, was entered by Hughes in the Bendix Trophy Air Race, where it would have competed against operational US fighters. Hughes' offer was turned down, however, because some feared the vintage German jet would outrun its competition. Among the racers Hughes' Me-262 was expected to face was the transonic North American F-86 Sabre jet, perhaps the most advanced combat aircraft of its day. The F-86 had acquired much of its wing technology from 1942 designs for a fully swept-wing Me-262. Although this advanced configuration was never constructed, the original Messerschmitt plans were put into practice by North American, converting what would have been a mediocre aircraft into a truly great transonic jet. Born into tragedy, Messerschmitt's Me-262 was the crowning achievement of the Luftwaffe. Meant to aid Nazi aggression, instead it ushered in an entirely new era, the jet age.